Hello and welcome back to Business Matters at the Hindu with me, K. Bharat Kumar. Last week, the government cleared a revival package worth 1.64 lakh crore for BSNL. 1.64 lakh crore. It's a significant amount. Takes a few seconds to get your head around it, right? Let's get into the details and see what it entails. BSNL, or Bharat Sanchar Nigam Ltd, was set up as a separate company in September of 2000 and took over the responsibility of providing telecom services throughout the country except Mumbai and Delhi from the government's own Dept of Telecom Services. For Mumbai and Delhi, of course, another company was set up, Mahanagar Telephone Nigam Ltd, or MTNL. The recapitalization exercise can be split into two parts. One is the cash component, the other is non-cash. Cash would entail infusion of about 44,000 crore into the company BSNL. Non-cash component includes allotment of 4G spectrum, capital expenditure support for deployment of indigenous 4G technology, debt restructuring, viability gap funding for all the rural wireline or landline services that BSNL rendered between fiscal 2014-15 and fiscal 2019-20, and support for payment of AGR dues or adjusted gross revenue dues that all telecom companies pay into the government. In 2019 too, the government had rolled out a 70,000 crore package. It was a joint package for both BSNL and MTNL, predominantly to be used for their voluntary retirement scheme that they rolled out to their respective employees. Let's take a look at BSNL's financial performance over the last few years. From the table, you may see a couple of years that we've compared numbers for, FY16 and FY21. Why these 2 years? Because 2019 was the time when a voluntary retirement scheme was rolled out by the company and a significant number of employees took the option to retire. So you may see that revenue has steadily declined. It's 33,000 crore to about 18,600. Employee costs expectedly have plummeted. In FY16, they cost about 15,400 crore. It's come down to about 6,700. But even then, you notice that the loss has almost doubled to 7,400 crore. The government has also pointed out that FY21 was the time when the company has started seeing operational profit, which means before depreciation or amortization expenses or finance costs were added to the loss. Recently, Chairman P.K. Purwar has been quoted as saying that FY22 revenue, that is year ended March 2022, would be around 17,000 crore, which is a tad lower. Before the VRS in 2019, BSNL had a staggering headcount of about 1.5 lakh employees. About 78,000 of them opted for the VRS. As of June 2021, the headcount stood at 64,000. So if you look at employee cost as a percentage of revenue, before the VRS, BSNL had 50% of revenue as employee costs. After the VRS, it came down to 36%, but even then it was significantly higher when compared with private players. Take Bharti Airtel as an example. For FY21 and FY22, Bharti Airtel's employee expenses as a percentage of its revenue stood at around 4%. So it looks like BSNL still has a long way to go if that's a standard that it wants to match. You may be wondering why there are a couple of packages announced by the government, one in 2019 and one now. The one in 2019 was 70,000 crore, meant primarily for BSNL and MTNL to roll out their voluntary retirement scheme. The government has explained that the scheme in 2019 had helped make BSNL stable, and the one announced most recently would make it financially viable. What went wrong with BSNL's financial performance? After all, it was profitable for much of the first decade of this century. Looks like it was a convergence of stars that made it stall on its way. Take, for example, the report by the Standing Committee on Information Technology, in a report that it presented to Parliament in 2014 under the demand for grants. There was a deposition by a BSNL representative to the committee, and it cites the person as saying in the report that even though private operators had started offering mobile services in the late 90s, BSNL could only start doing so in 2002. Even then, by 2005-2006, when BSNL's expansion was at its peak, it was number 1 or number 2 in many states. The deposition talks of problems to do with non-procurement of equipment beginning at that time. Strangely, much of the visible problems that seem to have assaulted the company since then seem to center around procurement of equipment. In 2020, a nice analysis by our group newspaper Business Line pointed out that not only 6 months at that time had passed since the 70,000 crore lifeline was extended by the government, and already there was a spanner in the works that stalled BSNL's progress. In 2020, BSNL had floated a tender for procurement of 4G equipment, and it would have cost about 9,000 crore and would have meant upgradation of about 50,000 sites across the country. This was critical for BSNL at that time because it was fighting for revival and existence, because it was looking at 4G technology rollout at that point, and 2016 was the year when all of the country across service providers had access to 4G technology. So it was already behind by about 4 years at that point in time when it rolled out the contract. The tender was floated in March 2020, and in the subsequent month, the Telecom Equipment and Services Export Promotion Council wrote to the government objecting to the terms of the tender. It said the tender heavily favored multinationals and discouraged domestic makers of equipment from participating because of stiff conditions. One of the conditions was requirement of experience of setting up a network that catered to 20 million subscribers, for example. The national security angle also came up in the letter. The government asked BSNL to rework the tender, but questions by industry watchers remained. How come such objections didn't crop up when private operators placed such orders? And how come the national security angle came in only when BSNL used equipment that was not made in India? Just for context, it may be recalled that Bharti Airtel placed its $1 billion 4G equipment order with Nokia around the same time that year. Like the analysis pointed out, supporting domestic equipment makers is a great idea, but why should the entire burden fall upon BSNL? And that too, in this instance, for indigenously developed 4G technology that had not been tested on a mass scale before. But it looks like the pattern of BSNL carrying the burden of having to prove indigenous technology as being viable may continue, because the government has categorically stated that one of the reasons why they feel that BSNL needs support is to ensure that indigenous technology, domestically developed technology, gets a chance. Difficulty in accessing or procuring appropriate contemporary technology is not new to BSNL. It's not just confined to the 2020 incident. But back in 2008, BSNL came up with an ambitious plan to raise its network capacity by 94 million lines at a cost of $10 billion. If it had gone through at that time, it would have been the world's largest telecom order. Allegations of irregularity in the tendering process came up and the whole project was scrapped. Naturally, BSNL slipped up in terms of performance, and customers generally tend to look elsewhere if quality is an issue. Among other problems that BSNL seems to have faced, there's one that stands out as curious. The same standing committee report that we referred to earlier quoted the telecom department as having told the committee that not only were BSNL and MTNL having a large base of employees to support, but also that the skill sets that were required for rendering mobile and broadband services to customers were very different from the skills that were required to offer landline services. They may have had a point, but it's curious for two reasons. One, as we saw earlier in this discussion, between 2002 and 2005, BSNL seemed to have no problem in rendering quality services, and like we saw before, coming to slot number 1 or 2 in many states. Anecdotally, I myself at that point in time had been advised by friends saying, if you have a problem with any of the private sector operators, opt for BSNL. No call drops, coverage is excellent, and so on and so forth. So how come in those 3 or 4 years, BSNL performed very well when it came to mobile services? 2, when telecom operators began offering mobile services, where did they get their manpower from? They dipped into the trained manpower of BSNL and MTNL and said, hey, come to us and we'll do a great job. The second curious reason is when mobile operators in the private sector set up their operations in the late 90s, where did their manpower come from? They came from the cream of BSNL and MTNL. The private operators probably said, hey, come on, come join us and let's do a great job. Sure enough, private operators also had access to global know-how and technology in the form of joint ventures or investments. Bharti Airtel had Singapore Telecom as its investor. The SR Group, when it set up its telecom services in India, went with Hutchison. But considering the size that BSNL was, we saw FY 2016 was a 33,000 crore company, it surely had resources at its command to make sure it got the best know-how, technology, consultants, you name it. After having announced the package, the government said that BSNL would become profitable in about 3 to 4 years. That brings us to the important question, should profitability be a goal at all? An interesting debate has come about since then. Nobody disagrees with the fact that the government does need a telecom arm of its own. A couple of reasons. One, for help during disaster relief, and 2, for penetration of telecom services into nook and corner of the country as a social obligation. For example, as part of the revival package most recently announced, BSNL's merger with BBNL, which is responsible for the BharatNet optical fiber project countrywide, The merger would mean a combined asset of 14 lakh kilometers worth of optical fiber across the country. This is very important for accessing socially backward areas where private operators cannot be expected to provide commercially viable services. Only a government arm can take up that responsibility. Because if I happen to live in a really socially backward area, I have the right to expect the best telecom services, as would my sister, for example, who lives in a metro. On the other hand, after having lost close to 2 decades in terms of time to compete with the private sector, is it even feasible to expect BSNL to turn profitable soon? BSNL is not yet a pan-India 4G services operator at a time when 98% of the country's geography has 4G coverage. By 2016, all private sector operators had begun offering 4G services, and now we are 6 years away in 2022. And if there's any expectation of private sector participation in any of the projects that BSNL requires to do as part of meeting its social obligations, viability will always remain a concern. For example, a 19,000 crore BharatNet tender in July 2021 that was meant to connect 16 states under the private-public partnership model went without a single response from bidders. Again, commercial viability. So having profit as a goal comes with its own set of challenges. In fact, deciding on attainable goals will actually help better deployment of capital. But you never know. BSNL may still spring a surprise. For example, public sector banks are a great example of being able to meet social obligations without taking their eye off the net profit ball. What do you think? Should profits be a goal for BSNL? Leave your comments below. And till the next episode of Business Matters, it's goodbye from us. Have a lovely week ahead.